Good science does not intimidate opponents. That is not the method of true science. Biblical creation is good science because creationists are happy to debate and reason. That's always been my experience. But in the modern world, sadly, creation scientists are intimidated and bullied. And I can now give you some personal experience and anecdotes of that. First of all, scientists are intimidated if they sympathise with creationism. This is what Richard Dawkins has said. It's quite a famous quote. You may have heard of this before. Anyone who claims not to believe in evolution is either ignorant, stupid, insane, or wicked. And there's a message there for scientists today. If you sympathise with biblical creation, you're going to be labelled as ignorant, stupid, insane, or wicked. And that's not good science, to intimidate that way. Richard Dawkins also said, this is a quote I had earlier, no qualified scientist doubts that evolution is a fact. What he's really saying there is, if you're a scientist who doubts evolution, he considers you as not qualified. So these are ways that scientists get intimidated. The consequence of these kind of quotes are that academics are fearful of expressing support for biblical creation. I know academics in my university who really would like to expose the weaknesses of evolution, but they are fearful of doing that. I know a very distinguished microbiologist in my university who told me, he said, Stuart, I would like to create a unit exposing the weaknesses of the theory of evolution. But a few weeks later, he came back and he said, Stuart, I cannot do it. If I did that, I would be demoted. I could be sacked. I cannot do that. I have to keep quiet. So academics are fearful of their position. And scientists are intimidated in other ways. This is something Stephen Jones has said. He's an academic and a columnist in the UK. He said this, creationists spread pure poison. That was the title of his article. Inside the article, he didn't have a shred of evidence of how creationists spread pure poison. But there's an irony here, because surely that title is spreading pure poison. So there is this irony, the very things that creationists are accused of, sometimes the very thing the atheist is guilty of. This is some recent news from the United Kingdom. 2 head teachers were demoted for allowing creationism to be taught in their schools. What happened was there was a United States-based creationist church came to the primary schools. If it comes to the United States, it's even worse. And so the head teachers allowed these creationists to come into the school, and they gave some literature out with some criticisms of the theory of evolution. And because those books were let into the school, the head teachers were demoted. So it's getting tough to be a teacher, to be a scientist. It's getting very tough. Teachers have said to me, what can we do? Especially with this new law coming up in September, the teaching of evolution in primary schools, teachers have asked me, what can they do? It's really hard. One of the things I've recommended to teachers is that they tell the children that some of the greatest scientists that ever lived rejected the theory of evolution. Scientists like James Clerk Maxwell and Lord Kelvin and Sir Ambrose Fleming, and that many scientists today reject the theory of evolution. And if anyone complains about that, just say you are quoting facts of history and facts about life today, and surely they cannot be demoted for quoting facts and history. Creationists are sometimes labelled as an insignificant minority. This is what Richard Dawkins has said about myself and Andy McIntosh. It's a great privilege to be lumped together with Andy McIntosh in this way. But Dawkins has said, my purpose is to convey the sheer magnitude of the error that Burgess and McIntosh are attributing to their hugely more numerous establishment colleagues who accept evolution. Actually, I dispute that, because my experience is many scientists do not fully accept the theory of evolution. But again, this is this labeling of creationists. Scientists are threatened if they sympathise with creationism. I've had many abusive emails from atheist organisations. I'm going to show you one now. This is from the Brights atheist organisation. I don't know if you have these also in the United States. But I'll read you the email. Dear Stuart, I have heard that you welcome discussion with your students about design in nature. Well, that's quite difficult to avoid because I teach that subject, and I'm also co-editor of an international journal of design in nature, so it's quite difficult to avoid discussing it with my students. We would regard such a situation as being very serious and would seek to ensure you are called to account. And then he says, as always, we wish to be fair before proceeding to the next stage. One of the worrying things about these emails is they never really explained what the next stage was, whether it was abduction, assassination, or torture. So this was from John Wiltshire and the Brights Atheist Association. But creation scientists are targeted. And we also have these extreme anti-creation websites. I'm sure you've heard of the National Center for Science Education in the United States, a very extreme anti-creation website. And they inspired the creation of a similar website in Britain. This is one thing I wish the United States hadn't exported to Europe, because what has started in Britain is the British Centre for Science Education, a group of atheists who pretend to be scientists. Actually, they don't even have a high school science qualification between them, but they claim to be scientists and write some really nasty things about creation scientists. Here's one quote about myself. Burgess is a hardcore fundamentalist and leading creationist in UK academia, the one that actually frightens the author of this article the most. I'm labelled as the most frightening person in the United Kingdom. I was very brave of you to have me over here for this conference. And he goes on to say, we plan on writing to heads of department at his university to tell them about his creationist beliefs. They did that. The first I heard was when a famous physicist, Sir Michael Berry, wrote to me and he said, Stuart, is it true that you think I work for the devil? And I said, have you heard from the British Centre for Science Education? He said, yes, that's where I got this information from. Then I explained they've hardly got a high school qualification in science between them. And he said, okay, thank you for explaining that. But it does lead to some quite embarrassing situations. And sometimes creationists are named and shamed in the national press. This is the front page of the Times Higher Educational Supplement, a national newspaper in the United Kingdom. Notice the headline, Intelligent Design Creeps Onto Courses. The implied message is that there's something bad going on. And underneath there was a quotation, evolution is disastrous because if you teach people that they are animals, then it is inevitable that they will behave like animals. I remember having a coffee when I was at my university. I was in the coffee room, and my professorial colleagues said, hey, Stuart, have you seen this quote about evolution is disastrous? And they read it out to me. And I said, that sounds a bit like Ambrose Fleming, but it sounds a good quote. And that's pretty, whoever said that was a very brave thing of them to say that. They'll probably lose their job. And I said to my colleagues, so who said that? And they said, well, Stuart, it was you. It's got your photograph and it's got your name. So then my colleague said to me, it's been nice knowing you, Stuart. It's been good to work with you. Actually, I didn't lose my job, but again, that was a bit of an awkward situation. Many scientists keep quiet about their doubts on evolution. This is the result of this intimidation. I know many scientists who would love to speak out, say something to the press, the weaknesses of evolution, but they are too fearful. Many scientists wait until retirement to express their doubts about evolution. Earlier, I quoted Alan Linton, that biologist in the UK. When he was retired, he said, evolution is a man-made theory. If you ask him, why did you wait until you retired to say that? He'll say, well, if I said it earlier, I would have had to have retired earlier. So I had to wait until that point. I know biologists who are refused posts because they say they believe in biblical creation. That's very unnatural selection. Intimidation is not the method of true science. And when you think about all that intimidation, isn't there a message in that? Doesn't that tell you there's something wrong with the theory of evolution? If proponents have to resort to that kind of intimidation and bullying, surely they're worried about something. Surely they're very defensive about something. But number 5, I want to explain that biblical creation best explains the origin of the universe. This is another reason why biblical creation is good science. Conservation laws support biblical creation. The first law of thermodynamics says that matter cannot be created or be destroyed. And there's a simple conclusion from that. Only a creator can explain the existence of a vast universe that we live in. And the Big Bang Theory contradicts that first law of thermodynamics, because the Big Bang Theory says there was nothing, and then nothing exploded, and there was something. Well, that contradicts that first law of thermodynamics. Conservation laws are so important. In my university, one of the first things we teach our engineering students is the first law of thermodynamics. It is so important for design and for engineering. I could not do my designs without the first law of thermodynamics. I've worked on the British Skylark sounding rocket, and when I worked on the design of that, I could not have designed it if I couldn't do a calculation of the change of fuel into energy. I had to use the first law of thermodynamics. At the moment, I'm working with Team GB to design racing bicycles for the Rio Olympics. I could not do that without using the first law of thermodynamics. And I'm working with Triumph motorbikes to design better motorbikes. I couldn't do that without using the first law of thermodynamics. And in the origins debate, we cannot ignore that first law, and that first law supports biblical creation. There's an irony here that biblical creation is often called God of the gaps. Have you heard that? There's some gap in knowledge, and supposedly Christians fill that gap with God, so it's called God of the gaps. But actually, it's the Big Bang Theory, which is God of the gaps. A child says, how did the universe come into being? And the atheist says, the Big Bang did it. It's the God of the gaps. Again, that irony, the very thing that creationists are accused of, it's true of the Big Bang.